It started out as one of those rare, quiet Saturday afternoons where the world seems to slow down just enough to feel like a brief respite from the constant motion of life, and I had decided to take a leisurely drive around my neighborhood, a familiar routine I often used to decompress after a busy work week filled with back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and the subtle, unrelenting pressures that accompany office life. And I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a neighborhood that was generally calm, with tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and only the occasional jogger or dog walker interrupting the otherwise peaceful scenery. Yet I had no idea that this ordinary activity would quickly spiral into a confrontation that involved the police, neighbors peering out of their windows, and a level of entitlement I hadn't expected to encounter on a quiet residential street. I was driving my car at a pace slightly below the posted speed limit, not because I lacked confidence or skill, but because I was intentionally being cautious. The neighborhood streets were narrow, with cars parked at irregular intervals along the curb. Children sometimes played on the sidewalks, and I had noticed just that morning that several homeowners had left their garage doors open while their kids were riding bikes in the driveway. So slowing down felt both prudent and responsible, yet the subtle, careful attention I was giving to safety was apparently interpreted by someone else as deliberate obstruction, an assessment I could never have anticipated in the moment, especially given the serenity of the afternoon and the lack of any immediate hazard. After a few blocks, I became aware of a car approaching from behind, a compact SUV that seemed to be moving at a speed slightly faster than mine. Yet the driver hesitated to pass, instead lingering directly behind me, their presence accentuated by a series of impatient taps on the horn and occasional aggressive hand gestures through the open window, which I initially tried to ignore because I was focused on maintaining control of my vehicle and ensuring that pedestrians and other vehicles in the vicinity were safe. Yet there was something about the intensity of her expression that suggested this was not merely a matter of impatience, but a brewing sense of moral outrage, as though she had assumed the role of enforcer for neighborhood traffic norms, a self-appointed arbiter of what constituted acceptable driving. I glanced into my rearview mirror and caught sight of her face, and immediately I recognized the type one had heard about from friends and online stories, the classic Karen, whose sense of entitlement often exceeds her capacity for reason. A person quick to assume the worst about strangers and eager to escalate minor inconveniences into major conflicts, and in that moment, her brows were furrowed tightly, her lips pressed in a rigid line, as she leaned forward in her seat as though her sheer determination could somehow compel me to increase my speed, which only reinforced my resolve to continue driving cautiously, mindful of the children playing and the pedestrians walking, because yielding to intimidation felt like conceding not just the road, but my sense of responsibility. The tension was palpable as she began honking repeatedly, each honk accompanied by a sharp wave of her hand, then a pointed finger gesture, and eventually she leaned far enough out of the window that I could see her mouth moving, apparently shouting in my direction, though the distance and the rolling down of my own windows made it impossible to decipher the exact words. Yet the meaning was clear. She was demanding that I speed up, that I move aside, that I conform to her expectations of what constitutes proper driving etiquette, and I felt a mixture of disbelief and irritation, because at no point had I violated any traffic laws, created a hazard, or otherwise behaved recklessly, yet my mere adherence to cautious driving apparently constituted a personal affront. I considered pulling over to let her pass, but there were no driveways or clear areas where it would be safe to do so, without risking either my own vehicle or parked cars along the street. And moreover, I was hesitant to reward aggressive behavior by immediately giving in to her demands, a decision that reflected not stubbornness but a commitment to principle. Traffic laws and safety guidelines exist for a reason, and yielding to intimidation undermines both public order and personal accountability, a realization that made me tighten my grip on the steering wheel and maintain my course down the quiet avenue, scanning mirrors and intersections carefully, signaling turns appropriately, and generally maintaining a pace that was deliberate but entirely reasonable given the surroundings. As we continued down the street, I noticed a few neighbors watching from their front yards or porches, some pausing mid-task to observe the escalating drama, and I could see that the woman's gestures and facial expressions were drawing attention. Her entire demeanor won a growing exasperation, which only increased my awareness that the situation was no longer just a simple traffic matter, but a public performance of entitlement and self-righteous indignation, an attempt to assert control over the narrative of an entirely ordinary situation. And I felt a mix of incredulity and careful amusement at the absurdity of the unfolding events, because the entire conflict had originated from nothing more than my cautious adherence to speed limits and neighborhood safety norms. Eventually, she pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, a motion that immediately signaled to me that her response was about to escalate further. And within seconds, I realized with a sinking feeling that she was calling the police, reporting my behavior as some sort of imminent threat or reckless endangerment, despite the fact that my driving had been measured, consistent, and in strict accordance with traffic regulations. And I was struck by the surreal nature of the situation. One moment, I was enjoying a peaceful afternoon drive. The next, I was the subject of a formal complaint based entirely on someone else's perception and frustration. A reminder of how quickly ordinary interactions can spiral when misjudgment and overreaction are involved. As the minutes passed, my mind oscillated between frustration and disbelief, and I focused on maintaining my composure, keeping my hands visible on the wheel, avoiding sudden movements, and ensuring that my driving remained exemplary, because I understood that any misstep, however minor, could be interpreted as confirmation of the complaints being lodged against me, which would have been both unfair and unnecessary. And I reminded myself that patience and calm were the only tools I could control in a situation driven entirely by someone else's assumptions. Within what seemed like no time at all, the patrol cars appeared, their lights flashing briefly as they turned onto the street, a clear signal that the 911 call had been taken seriously. And one officer approached my vehicle while the other followed the woman's car, speaking to her in a controlled but firm manner, asking questions about the alleged danger I had supposedly presented. And I felt a surreal sense of vindication in knowing that my cautious, law-abiding behavior would ultimately be validated by trained professionals, even as the embarrassment of public attention and the absurdity of the escalation weighed heavily on the entire encounter. I was instructed to pull over to the side of the road, which I did carefully, positioning my car safely and placing my hands visibly on the steering wheel. And the officer approached calmly, asking for my license and registration before inquiring about what had happened, giving me an opportunity to explain succinctly and accurately that I had been driving carefully, well below the neighborhood speed limit, and that the woman behind me had appeared impatient and confrontational, ultimately calling 911 to report a non-issue, a description that highlighted the extreme discrepancy between actual behavior and perceived threat. The woman provided her account immediately afterward, embellishing details and portraying my cautious driving as deliberate obstruction and intimidation, which underscored the degree to which personal perception and frustration can distort ordinary circumstances into events that appear alarming when filtered through a lens of entitlement and a lack of patience. And I noticed the officers taking careful notes, asking clarifying questions, and referencing neighborhood traffic patterns to contextualize the situation, demonstrating that reason and due process would ultimately determine the outcome, rather than exaggeration or impulse. After reviewing the situation, speaking with the neighborhood manager who had witnessed the exchange, and assessing the safety and legality of my driving, the officers explained to the woman that I had done nothing wrong, that my pace was appropriate given the environment, and that calling 911 over a vehicle operating entirely within legal limits is a misuse of emergency services. Advice delivered calmly but firmly, which visibly embarrassed her, causing her posture to slump slightly and her tone to soften as the reality of the situation became apparent. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in observing that her attempt to escalate a minor inconvenience had been diffused by professionalism, reason, and adherence to law, rather than through confrontation or argument. Once the officers departed, I resumed my drive, maintaining the same cautious pace as before, reflecting on how ordinary actions in public spaces can be reframed by others' assumptions into perceived offenses. And I considered the broader implications, how entitlement, impatience, and a desire for control can magnify minor frustrations into conflicts with real consequences, and how remaining calm, lawful, and measured is the most effective way to navigate interactions that might otherwise escalate unnecessarily. By the time I returned home, the sun had set fully, casting a warm amber glow over the neighborhood and providing a visual counterpoint to the tension of the previous encounter. And as I parked in my driveway, I took a moment to breathe, acknowledging that while the episode had been absurd in retrospect, it also served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of social interactions, the ease with which misunderstandings can escalate, and the value of patience, composure, and perspective in the face of overreaction and entitlement. lessons that I carried with me long after the flashing lights disappeared down the street. Though there were no lasting legal consequences, the experience left an impression, one that reinforced my awareness of how quickly ordinary behavior can be misconstrued, and how important it is to maintain calm, courteous, and responsible conduct in public spaces, regardless of the reactions of others, because in moments of conflict, reason and lawfulness often speak louder than anger or exaggeration. In the quiet, victory lies in knowing that your actions were right even when others perceive them differently, a truth that becomes particularly clear when watching someone else's overreaction deflate in the face of fairness and authority, leaving the absurdity of the situation to stand on its own as a cautionary tale about entitlement, perception, and the value of restraint in everyday life.